Hello and welcome to the next Power review summary of Path of Exile's new Ascendancy expansion. Path of Exile, for those of you who don't know, is a free-to-play title very similar to that of Grim Dawn, Diablo 2, well, Diablo 3 now, and other games like that. And it's got like a very pleasant mix between those sorts of games. It's got that Diablo-esque generic gameplay. It also has it is quite grim, so it's closer to Grim Dawn in terms of visual style, but it actually looks pretty damn great. I mean, visually, it is a pretty good title, and if you take a look at our performance analysis, you'll see that the game has been optimized to Kingdom Come and back. It just runs really well. Of course, there is always the occasional issue of if you're running a ridiculous discharge or trap build, then the amount of traps exploding on the screen is going to cause your system to slow down very briefly because it just has to calculate tons of things at once. But for the most part, the performance is relatively decent, and go ahead and check out performance analysis if you're interested in that stuff. But for the most part, the expansion just takes a relatively good game. I mean, it's beloved by a hell of a lot of people and makes it just a whole lot better. So obviously this game has an itemization system, has the gem system, has a weird currency system involving the orbs that you modify gear with, and it just adds a whole lot more. Obviously there aren't any new currency orbs, but there are new items, new gems, new everything, and just changes to a lot of stuff as well. And it brings this new Parandus League. Now, for the most part, I'm doing this review based on the Parandus League and not Standard League, because Standard doesn't get a whole lot of the new shiny stuff. And the Parandus League introduces a couple of interesting new things. So for the first part, it does offer new gems. It also adds these this trader, which you'll randomly see pop up around maps as you're going through it. And this trader has done quite a few interesting things, and one of the negatives for this is that there are a lot of players who play this game for the trading aspect and just making tons and tons of currency. For what purpose, I don't know. They just like to trade a lot. And the Parandus League specifically has, in some players' eyes, broken the economy, in that a lot of items which cost ludicrous amounts of gems, like 10, 20, 30, 40 exalted orbs, and made them cost significantly less. Now, the traders aren't particularly happy with this in that specific league, and eventually those items will filter into the Standard League when, you know, the term of this league, this Parandus League, ends and the new one begins. All those items will then get dumped into Standard and then mess up the costing of all the other items. So for new players and for players like me who aren't really interested in farming hundreds of exalteds and paying out the nose for really awesome gear, it's actually really good. So you can buy, you get this chance in that this Parandus coin vendor will offer you a unique, and you can pay for it in Parandus coins, which are dropped from these Parandus lockbox that are also randomly generated about the place. And sometimes you can get them for this singular tiny currency, and if you don't need it, then you can either not buy it or buy it and then sell it on. Now, this has very frequently offered some really sweet items for not many coins at all, maybe a few thousand for the slightly more awesome unique items. And coins are actually really easily obtained. I mean, in the later leagues, you can get hundreds of coins from various boxes. And so items are getting cheaper in terms of the weird way the currency works, which is fantastic for new players. It just adds this whole new approachability level for new players into the game. Now, obviously, the traders don't like this because it's messing up their economy, but for the most part, we don't care about those people. The new areas look absolutely fantastic. This introduces, it doesn't add a new act or anything like that. This is merely sort of adding to the base content as opposed to the storyline. So it's not adding new story, and kind of is adding a couple of new characters, but for the most part the act system is the same and the progression is still the same. It's just in this Parandus League you now have these boxes appearing all over the place and a new currency to buy items in order to improve your progress throughout the game. And it's also adding these little like challenges, and these challenges you have to complete 6 of them overall in the whole game. So in your normal cruel and merciless league you'll get 6 in each of those, and when you complete those 6 challenges you'll then unlock the labyrinth. Labyrinth is awesome. Basically, it's sort of like a really old school dungeon crawler where you complete an area and then you can have a sneak peek at where the next area leads on this little map. And some are dead ends, some will contain keys, some will contain caches that those keys unlock. But for the most part, the goal is to get to the end of this labyrinth. And if you die, then you have to start all over again. And it's sort of separated into thirds. The first third you'll fight this big main boss who is awesome, fantastic, looks brilliant, and it's sort of surrounded by traps, so it adds this new layer of sort of challenge towards it all. The boss looks awesome. The new bosses, the new enemy types just look fantastic overall. And once you've completed that boss 3 times, you then unlock your Ascendancy points. Now, the new Ascendancy system is actually really quite awesome because it's a new, and it has a massive effect on the way you play the game and how you build your character, but it's not massive in that it's as daunting as the passive skill tree system. Now, one of the main negatives about Path of Exile is also its positives, and that's the passive skill tree system. The first time you look at that system as a new player, you think, oh god, this is an absolute nightmare. How am I supposed to make any sense of this? But if you're someone like me who's played the game for 100 hours or so, the passive skill tree system is one of the main sort of gravitating points for a lot of players to the game, just because there are so many different options, and the way this game builds characters is just unique on the offset. Like, there is no game that plays character building customization as well as Path of Exile does. So yeah, it's daunting for new players, but once you get into it, it really unlocks the amount of builds and the way you can build around things, and with the sheer amount of items and unique passives and all this crazy stuff that it has, lots and lots of builds can work endgame. Now, initially in Path, there were a select few builds which were horrendously overpowered. Everyone would rush towards them because they were the best for the endgame. And there were a couple of builds which were interesting but just weren't viable. And it feels like in Ascendancy, with the new balances and the new Ascendancy skill tree and the passive changes, a lot of the builds that you're capable of making are actually viable in the endgame now, which feels a whole lot more awesome. And one thing I really like about the Ascendancy point system is it improves some skills that you may not have thought would sort of play a large factor into your endgame builds. Like, I played a Flicker Strike build, which for the most part, crit chance, damage, attack speed, whatever, you just find those nodes on the passive skill tree and you're done. But one of the most awesome things that I discovered in the Ascendancy skill tree is there's actually like a trickster Ascendancy, which means that movement-based skills cost nothing. Now, for my character, I use Whirling Blades and Flicker Strike, which are both attack skills, but they're also classed as movement skills, so I can cast those for free. Of course, Flicker Strike still requires frenzy charges, and I won't go into that, but it's still really awesome that you can dump yourself into these absolutely ridiculous builds, and the Ascendancy system will actually cater itself towards almost every build you can possibly think of. Obviously, it's quite limited in scope. It's quite a small little passive system, this Ascendancy build stuff, but it is quite good in the way that it opens up your options. The Parandus Trader is kind of cool, I guess, but a lot of the time you will find that he's offering completely useless items in the early leagues, and a lot of it is down to sort of farming areas in the hopes that he'll randomly generate himself and offer new items. Which, you know, for some players, farming stuff endgame can get quite boring, but this guy just adds a little bit of randomness, and I don't know, it feels like the potential to get decent items from him is a lot higher than just farming maps endgame as you usually would. So he just feels like a better addition to the whole thing. Another thing I've noticed is I haven't played Path in such a long time. I haven't played it since the expansion that added Act 4, I think, with Malachi. And one thing I've noticed is that now that I've replayed the game from start to finish through a couple of the different difficulty modes on the new league, is they've actually seemed to have added or modified the soundtracks for almost all the areas. So the game feels a whole lot more creepy, and a hell of a lot more atmospheric. Now, I don't know when this was added, whether it was added in the last expansion or a patch recently, but if it was added as part of this expansion, it's awesome because it actually made me not turn off the music in the game. Usually I'd listen to a little bit of a playlist that I've got generated on my music player and just farm some stuff. But I actually feel compelled to listen to the soundtrack now because it feels good and it gets you in the mood. The other awesome thing that this game has added is the challenges. I think there's 40 or 50 challenges overall. And for every so many challenges you complete, you'll get to unlock an item. Now, Path of Exile is so popular and so wonderful, not least because it's an excellent game, but because it's the only game that has done free-to-play correctly, in that you cannot buy anything for real money from grinding gear games, that is. Of course, there are Chinese farmers and sellers or whatever. You cannot buy anything in the game that will help you with real money at all. everything that you can buy in terms of microtransaction is purely cosmetics, and that's probably why it's so successful still to this day. It's a good game. People are paying for cosmetics because they want to, and they're just making loads of money from that, and that's great. But what they've added in Ascendancy is the ability to complete these challenges, which are pretty damn hard. It's not, an easy cakewalk and everyone's going to be walking around with all these free items. Every time you complete so many of these challenges, you unlock a cosmetic item. So they've now added this added little bonus of you can now get cosmetics without having to pay money. Obviously, there's not a huge amount. I think there's 5 or something. You get like an armor set and a new portal, which they never offered for free before. And so they're taking that free-to-play thing and really, really running with it. And this, weird little addition of this challenges aspect, unlocking cosmetic items, is just, another good thing to say about the company. The other thing, the one negative I do still have about the game is that it is kind of repetitive still for new players. I know people who play Diablo and Path of Exile and Grim Dawn, they don't mind the repetitive nature of these games, but there are a lot of people that are put off by the fact that the game, you are still doing the same thing over and over again. Now, the end game, I would say, for Path of Exile is still better than the end game for most action RPGs, in that the maps are such high in variety. But it still does have that repetitive nature. And the other thing that's really quite annoying is that in games like Grim Dawn, when you can spend minimal amounts of currency in order to reset your entire build, in Path of Exile it's near impossible for a newish player to reset a character and try out a new build, simply because the gems that are required in order to reset your passive talent tree are so rare that they cost an awful lot of currency. So for new players, in order to try out a new build, they basically have to make a new character and complete the game 3 times in a row and buy new items and farm currency all over again. So that resetting of a character is still a problem, but for the most part, lots of players in the end game who have put in hundreds of hours into the game are going to have that currency to reset stuff, and a lot of people find making new characters fun anyway. So I guess it will affect a relatively small minority of players who do like to switch up builds constantly, particularly if they're used to games like Grim Dawn and Diablo, where you can sort of do things on the fly. So I do feel like that should be changed in the future. I know a lot of people may not agree with that sentiment, but it feels like one of the few things that is holding Path of Exile back from new players is not just the passive skill tree being daunting, because that's easily overcome by simply spending lots of hours in the game, but the fact that you have to create a new character if you want to try something different, especially if you mess up your build as a new player, which you will do the first time you play, because the passive skill tree system is quite difficult to get into. You basically have to do a lot of research before you make a character, and that's not necessarily fun for people who are just coming into these things. So obviously I know this was supposed to be a review of Slain, but unfortunately the publishers did not get back to me in time, and review keys didn't come out until today actually, so I never managed to get that in, and we've already got reviews booked in for the next few weeks, so we won't be doing anything on Slain. But never mind, you did get an interview with Upstream Arcade, and I did get to play Path of Exile again, which was pretty cool. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this review, and we'll see you on Saturday for our next Week in Gaming episode.